Today, we're diving into what you might call the essential origin story of modern narrative in Korea
Yeah, we're really looking at that moment where storytellers, well, they kind of ditched the obligation of just official history.
and started writing just for the fun of it. Or maybe, human interest.
Something like that.
Sure.
We're looking closely at a really key piece of scholarship. D. Eliseev's 1968 study on pхсоль literature.
Tissel. Yeah.
And our mission really is to take this pretty obscure medieval genre.
Right. I haven't heard much about it.
No, it's not widely studied.
Yeah.
But we want to show how it was this critical bridge, this sort of literary laboratory
Yeah.
that connected those formal historical chronicles to, well, what we think of as the modern novella.
Okay, so let's get specific then. What is pxsol? Because, yeah, to the modern ear, that sounds pretty academic, hyper niche even.
It is, a bit. It's the Korean term for a really large body of medieval short prose.
Short prose.
Yeah, small forms, active roughly between the 12th and, say, 17th centuries. And the main thing, it's defined by its absolute heterogeneity. It's
Variety.
meaning a single collection of pile might have notes on local events, legends, little novelettes, short records, anecdotes, just anything, really.
Yeah, kind of catch-all.
Exactly, the catch-all for anything noteworthy that didn't quite fit into the, the official histories or religious texts.
And you mentioned it's understudied, even in Korea.
Significantly understudied, yeah. Which really makes Eliseev's attempt to structure it so important.
Why was his work foundational then?
Because he was one of the first to really try and categorize this incredibly varied stuff. He provided a kind of blueprint showing how literary genres,
Like fiction.
yeah, specifically fiction and the short story, how they start to break away, to differentiate themselves from nonfiction. It shows us those messy first steps of literary independence.
Okay, so to get that break, we need to know what came before, right, before the 12th century, what was prose like?
Right. Before pхsоль, it was really dominated by two things. Massive court-commissioned official histories.
The big state records.
Yep. And religious hagiography, the lives of saints and revered figures. So you had the monumental record of the state and the formal records of the holy.
That sounds like it leaves a lot out.
It created this huge literary vacuum. Official histories, they were written by court historians under imperial decree, focused strictly on state significance.
Geopolitics, wars, who's king?
Exactly. Anything smaller, anecdotal, daily life stuff,
Yeah.
it was just excluded. The literary etiquette back then was incredibly rigid.
So what filled that vacuum? What was the bridge?
That's the key transitional genre, yasa. It means unofficial history.
Unofficial, okay.
And these were revolutionary because they were written by private individuals, scholars, maybe officials, but outside the direct court mandate.
So they could write about different things.
They finally felt free to record all the stuff the official histories ignored.
Okay, but here's a crucial detail. You mentioned the language. These yasa collections, they were still written in Chinese, right? Wenyan.
Correct. Wenyan.
So how revolutionary could the content really be if the form and the language were still tied to this, very conservative literary language used by elites across East Asia?
That is the perfect question. And yes, Wenyan was a conservative force. Think of it like the Latin of the Far East back then.
Right. Favored conciseness, elegance.
Illusion, yeah. But the revolutionary step wasn't necessarily the language itself, but the choice of subject.
Ah.
The medieval author, using this very elegant, formal language, started recording everything they personally found noteworthy, regardless of its importance to the state.
So the content just shifts wildly.
Absolutely. You look at yasa collections, and they feel almost like modern travel notes or diaries.
Really?
Yeah, you get detailed landscape descriptions right next to local folk legends, maybe funny stories about famous poets, or descriptions of some unusual local ritual.
Wow. So applying high style to kind of low subjects, or at least everyday subjects?
Precisely. High style applied to daily life, human interest things.
So the big takeaway here is that Yasa was that critical first step away from just monolithic history.
It really was. Eliseev argued yasa was, and I quote roughly here, literature grown out of chronicle records and oral folk art.
Okay.
And its lasting importance. It shows the very first clear signs that writers were starting to differentiate genres based on human experience, not just, what the emperor wanted recorded.
That sets the stage perfectly for pxsol itself then. Now, Eliseev, you said, organized these messy pxsol collections. What were his main categories?
He identified four primary genre groups within them: legend, novella, anecdote, and Information.
Legend, novella, anecdote, information.
Got it. But you also mentioned it's hard to tell them apart in the original text.
Very hard. Often the entries were just separated by a little red line, no titles, nothing. So yeah, the modern scholar is doing the work the medieval scribe didn't bother with.
Right. So let's start with legend. What did Eliseev find there? Well, his key finding was that legend was the very first prose folklore genre to really penetrate book literature systematically.
Meaning it moved from just being told orally to being something worth writing down and adapting.
Exactly, across that threshold.
Okay, that sounds straightforward. Folktale gets written down. But you highlighted Eliseev's analysis of the legend of King Talhai. He lived way back in the 1st century AD.
Yes.
What did comparing different versions of that single story reveal? Why was that important?
It revealed something pretty profound, actually, about the difference between just being a folklorist and being an author.
How so?
By tracking how different writers from the 9th century up to the 14th handled the same basic folk story. Eliseev proved they weren't just passive scribes.
Oh,
They weren't just recording oral tales word for word.
they were actively shaping the narrative then. What does that mean for, say, comparative literature? If we find 5 versions of an old Chinese or Korean folktale.
It means we're not just looking at variations in the oral tradition. We might be looking at 5 different literary agendas.
Aha, that's the key insight.
That's the aha moment, yes. Especially for researchers working on ancient and medieval stuff in the Far East. These authors were consciously conforming the raw material, the folk story, to the specific laws of the genre they were writing in.
So if it was going into a history book,
They'd stress the miraculous birth, the state significance, things like that.
but if it went into pastral,
They might focus more on the human drama, maybe some irony, or a particular character detail. They were adapting it. It proves the story was now seen as literary material, not just a cultural record to be preserved.
okay, fascinating. Let's move to the next one. The novella, or you call it novelette.
Right, Eliseev called it novella, but novelette might be more accurate for these early forms. This genre really flourished later, more like 15th to 17th centuries.
And it marks a big shift in focus, doesn't it? Away from kings and saints.
Towards the average person, yeah, it's a real democratization of literary focus.
And where did these stories come from? What was the source material?
Eliseev links it directly to the minhwa genre. These are prosaic folktales,
Prosaic meaning.
meaning ordinary, down-to-earth, often satirical domestic tales. The key thing about minhwa is the near-total lack of fantasy. It's grounded in everyday life, everyday problems, very secular.
Got it. And structurally, these pastral novelettes are pretty specific.
Very concise, typically.
Hmm.
Eliseev noted what he called single-event developing.
Single event.
Yeah, the action develops around one core event. It lacks the complex multi-episode plots or, the breaking of the action, delaying tactics that you might see in the later, longer novellas.
Like those by Kim Se-sup in the 15th century, he wrote longer pieces.
Exactly. His work is more complex. These pchol novelettes are simpler, more direct.
And that structural clarity, that helps us separate it from the next genre, the anecdote, because they sound pretty close, short-focused stories.
They are very close and often appear right next to each other in the collections. So yeah, we really have to rely on analyzing the composition, the structure, to tell them apart.
So how did Eliseev suggest doing that? Distinguishing the novelette from the anecdote.
He focused on how the action is presented. The anecdote, he argued, has an exposed or isolated action,
Exposed.
meaning it's kind of plucked out, detached from the character's broader life or context. The setup, the exposition is super minimal.
Just enough to get the point.
Just enough to land the punchline or the witty remark or the surprising twist. The novelette, even though it's brief, usually gives you a bit more context, a slightly more developed setting.
Okay. And what types of anecdotes did he find in pastral?
He identified 2 main types: historical anecdotes,
About famous people.
right, poets, princes, scholars, generals, real historical figures,
Yeah.
and then domestic anecdotes.
Ah, like stock characters.
Exactly, relying on universal types like the foolish son-in-law, the clever wife, the young widow, that sort of thing, found across many cultures.
Now, the source material we looked at raises a really interesting point about the historical anecdotes, about their social environment.
It does, yeah. It makes you think, who's actually reading these things?
Right.
The reviewer pointed out, for instance, anecdotes about a 15th century writer like Quittle, maybe involving some witty but very specific literary criticism.
Sounds pretty niche.
Exactly. That kind of story was likely only known and really appreciated by the highly educated elite who knew Quittle's work in context.
Okay, so not exactly common knowledge.
Not at all. And that's a stark contrast to what you might call historical folk anecdotes. Think about stories about Peter the Great in Russia, or maybe Sukin in China.
Those spread everywhere, right? Among common people, too.
Widely circulated, yeah. So even within the same basic genre, the historical anecdote, the specific content and its social habitat really determine the audience and likely the story's function. Different circles, different stories.
That brings us to a really crucial point for anyone studying medieval literature, not just Korean.
Yeah.
We have to look at all the past material, right? Not just the plot-driven stuff.
Absolutely. Because often the non-plot material, the notes, the sketches, the information, makes up the majority of the prose from that era, whether it's in Russia, China, or Korea.
So if we only hunt for plot, for stories, we miss the bigger picture. We miss the forest for the trees, kind of.
Precisely. And Eliseev, to his credit, did pay attention to this non-plot material. He categorized it broadly as sketch. The Russian word is ochurk and information.
Though you mentioned those terms might sound a bit too modern.
They do sound a little anachronistic for 12th century texts, perhaps, but the idea of categorizing these non-narrative entries is important.
Let's focus on the sketch, the ochurk. What did that look like in a medieval Korean context?
Well, according to Eliseev, it was really characterized by an emphasis on factual veracity. The author's main goal seemed to be truthfulness, detailed observation, recording a real event or a real person's life accurately.
Like the example of General Kanggamshan from the 10th century.
Exactly. Eliseev highlighted how the author stressed the facts of his military career, his accomplishments. It reads like a biographical record.
But even in these factual-seeming records, there were hints of new literary habits emerging, weren't there? Something wasn't quite traditional history.
Yes, exactly. The reviewer questioned the genre's origin a bit, pointing to some really unusual compositional choices.
Like what?
Well, in that sketch of General Kanggamshan,
Right.
the legendary account of his miraculous birth, which is pure folklore, right?
Right.
That was placed at the end of the sketch, almost like an appendix.
Instead of at the beginning, like in a traditional biography or hagiography.
Exactly. Traditionally, the miraculous birth establishes the hero's credentials right up front, putting it at the end. It's a structural choice that shows the author is already maneuvering, maybe separating the sketch from older, more rigid historiographical forms. Something new is happening compositionally.
Okay, so we've tracked this fascinating lineage from official records through Yasa into the varied forms of Kaisel, seeing the beginnings of fiction. Let's wrap up by looking at the major critiques of Eliseev's work. These seem relevant to anyone studying medieval literature today.
They really are.
Hmm.
There were two main structural critiques highlighted in the review we read. The first big one is the problem of anachronism, applying modern concepts backwards in time.
How did Eliseev do that?
He used the modern Russian concept of khudozestveni literature, which basically translates to artistic or belletristic literature, essentially fiction. And he tended to equate artistic with plot-driven.
Ah, but that's our modern bias, right? If we look at the medieval worldview.
Precisely. In the medieval period, historical prose, travel diaries, philosophical notes, even those factual sketches we just discussed, those were often considered the highest forms of artistic expression. They valued elegance, veracity, moral insight.
Which weren't necessarily tied to plot.
Not at all. So this creates a trap. If we go in assuming artistic means fiction with a plot, we risk ignoring or devaluing all the prose the medieval authors and readers themselves might have valued most.
So the first step for scholars is?
You have to try and reconstruct the actual medieval Korean genre system on its own terms. What did they think was literature? What did they think was art? Only then can we start applying our modern concepts carefully.
Okay, that makes sense. What was the second major critique?
That was what the reviewer called the folklore gap. Basically, Eliseev didn't sufficiently use the tools of comparative folklore.
Meaning he didn't look at global motif indexes or compare with neighboring cultures.
Right. He didn't systematically use comparative data from China, Japan, or broader folklore studies to reconstruct the likely folk prototypes of the stories found in pxsol.
So he might have missed tracing the origins of those common stock characters we mentioned. The foolish son-in-law, the young widow, the blind man.
Exactly. Those characters are international travelers. They appear in folk traditions everywhere. Comparative folklore helps confirm their oral roots and track their transmission before they get written down and adapted in pxsol.
So it provides external evidence, a way to check the oral source material claims.
It does. It's just another layer of the meticulous scholarship needed in this field, especially when you're dealing with texts that are centuries old and bridging oral and written traditions.
And speaking of meticulousness, Our source did note a few small but, necessary corrections to Eliseev's text itself. Minor errors.
Yeah, a few were pointed out. Things like apparently confusing the Qin and Jin dynasties in China, which are separated by like 500 years. A significant difference,
Ouch.
or a slight historical inaccuracy regarding the famous poet Kuai Yuan's death, the circumstances of his self-drowning, and also misnaming the protagonist Yugong, the foolish old man who moves mountains from the philosopher Lizi's work.
Okay, so minor slips. Perhaps understandable in such a massive cross-cultural study from the 60s.
Absolutely understandable. But they do underscore the challenges, right? And the absolute necessity of rigorous, cross-referenced historical and linguistic scholarship when working in this area. You have to get the details right.
Definitely. So, wrapping this up, the key takeaway for you, our listener, is this. You now understand, Peish, that raw, messy, diverse body of Korean medieval prose as the essential laboratory.
Yeah, the testing ground.
This is the place where folklore first got systematically adapted, structured, secularized, and turned into written stories. It marks the true birth, you could say, of the genre we now call the novella, or the short story in Korea.
It really is the origin story of literary independence. It shows that writing about human interest, writing outside of official state control, that's a long, centuries-long struggle for recognition and form.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. If the whole concept of artistic literature was so vastly different back then, if it included historical chronicles, philosophical notes, travel diaries, all that non-plot stuff, what are we potentially missing today when we sometimes rigidly separate fact from fiction?
What knowledge, what insight gets lost when we maybe overlook those non-plot entries, when we only hunt for the structured stories?
Something to think about, perhaps, the next time you pick up a history book or even read the news.
Definitely. Until the next deep dive.